Hey guys, so the round will be starting in exactly 1 minute. Okay, so the rounds are going to start now. Can I please have all of the debaters participating in the finals have their cameras on for the duration of this debate? Judges can choose to keep their cameras on or off. For all spectators, please keep your cameras off and muted at all times. I'll pass it over to Jacqueline, who is our chair, to say a few words if she'd like.
Okay, excellent. Apologies, everyone. I will keep my camera off for this just because I've been running into some technical issues with my internet, which is why my camera will be off. Before we get started, though, let's do some introductions, given this is a grand final. So first, I want to congratulate all of the debaters who've made it to the final. I believe we're still missing a team, though. I believe we're missing FDT PG, if I'm not mistaken, Isabella.
I believe FTTZS and FTG, yeah, PG, they are missing. They're still in the prep room. I'm gonna be moving them in here right now. They should be in here in about a minute.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, we'll hold off until they get here in just a moment. Oh, they are here. Excellent. Okay, so we'll begin with some introductions. We'll start with the panel just so that we can get that out of the way. So hi, my name is Jacqueline. I'll be the chair for this final. I use she or they pronouns, but please refer to the panel as a whole, and I look forward to a great round. I'll let my panelists introduce themselves as well in the order that's listed on TabbyCat.
All right, so I'm Godswill. I'm Godswill Ifanchukwu. I will be paneling in this grand finals. It's such an honor.
And then that leaves me. My name is Lila Lavender. I will also be on the panel. I use she, her pronouns. Excited for a great debate.
Okay, thank you so much to the two judges for introducing themselves. Next, we'll move on to the debaters at opposition. Please introduce yourselves, name, speaker order, and then any pronouns if you would like to let us know.
My name is Dia Perry. I will be the Prime Minister as well as the proposition reply, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, I'm Ekat Govsky. I'm the second proposition speaker, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi,
Thank
my
you.
name is
Moving
Leo
on.
Zhu.
Oh,
sorry.
Okay, go for it.
All right, my name is Leo Zhu. I'm going to be the first speaker for you inside opposition today. He, him pronouns, please.
Hi, my name is Arnon Singh. I'm going to be the second speaker. On side opposition, I also use he and pronouns, and I prefer verbal POIs.
Okay, excellent. Before we start, a few notes of housekeeping. The first is just in terms of timing. I'll put 1, 5, 6, and 6:15 into the chat, but I encourage you all to keep time just so you know where you are at between those amounts. At 6:15, all judges will stop taking notes, but feel free to wrap up your last sentence.
Wait, just
The
to clarify,
second
this is
thing
8-minute speeches.
Sorry, 1, 7, 8,
Yeah.
8:15. Just came from the junior category. My apologies. So 8 minutes. Thank you for that. The second thing is if you are running into any tech issues, please let us know in the chat and then we'll work to resolve them. No need to stress. The third thing is please let us know your POI preferences before you begin. Let's default to using the chat though, just so we aren't disrupting anyone during their speeches. But if you prefer verbal or visual, please let us know. Final note is for all of the observers and spectators, please make sure to not turn on your cameras, use the chat, or unmute. So without further ado, unless there are any questions, I would now like to call this house to order. The motion before us today is this house prefers world A over world B, the worlds being defined in the info slide. Without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker from proposition to open the government case for us in a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Here.
Thank you. Confirming everybody can hear me okay?
You are audible.
Yeah.
Great. If we think about the concept of karma, it's actually pretty messed up because not everybody gets what they deserve. And in fact, a lot of people get things that they are undeserving of. Universal morality has been strived for centuries within philosophical studies, and I think in World A, we might just have finally found it. Today, I'm going to do a few things for you as your first proposition speaker. First, I'm going to talk to you a bit about our stance, our model, what we think this debate is going to look like, and then our first two arguments on 1, equality, and 2, the categorical imperative. Okay. Let's get into our stance and our model then. We think this is pretty straightforward. We'd prefer world A over world B. However, we think within world A, we're not saying that violence will never be used. We think that that is an impossible narrative to go about. We think it will still happen, both small and large scale. However, there will be a general consensus within all of society that people are raised with, so they will generally abide by the narrative that all violence in all scenarios is bad. With that, let's get into our first argument on equality. In a world where people believe that violence is always wrong, they are more likely to view everybody around them as equal, and therefore a more equitable society will exist. What do I mean by this? People will see that no matter what circumstances somebody finds themselves in, and no matter what one has done, they are still undeserving of violence. That creates a blanket of equality over all people so that no matter what somebody has done to you, whether they be a good or bad person in your eyes, they are all still deserving of the exact same treatment, and that level of equal treatment is impossible to achieve on opposition. The counterfactual being that some people deserve that violence because they did something to deserve it. The problem here is that that mindset of deservedness is likely to seep into every other aspect of society on opposition. For example, people who live in deep poverty must be living that way because they did something to deserve that life circumstance. Or people who are trapped in abusive relationships must have done something to mandate that abuse. Because aside from when people deserve bad things, those things are bad. That's likely the narrative that's going to happen on opposition. Go ahead.
So in World A, would using violence to further equality or to resist oppression be considered unethical?
Violence on all grounds is unethical, even in cases where it could be reciprocal in response to something that might be like a violation of some sort of moral high ground. We think it's pretty clear in the info slide that regardless of the scenario, violence would never be acceptable to use. And that's exactly why we create that blanket of equality that can't exist on opposition. We think that it's disgusting for a narrative to exist in which some people are the exception. Some people deserve bad things to happen to them. They deserve that violence to be exacted upon them, and they deserve whatever life scenario they might be in because they must have done something to deserve that. Under the mindset of opposition in World B, when people are taught that you are allowed to exact violence onto those who have done something to deserve it. For example, reciprocal violence. If ECAT shoves me and I punch her back, I think that she must have deserved that because she did something to me in the first place. That's the very mindset that's likely to seep into every other aspect of society and make it so that people are unlikely to be helped. So the impact out of all of this is that World A is more likely to have things like a fair and equitable justice system where everybody is seen completely equally under the eyes of the law. We're likely to have more things like social welfare, where people are helped bring themselves out of things like poverty because they don't deserve to live in that condition. Unlike opposition, where there exists that general societal mindset that bad things happen to those who deserve those bad things to happen to them. Before I get into my second argument on the categorical imperative, I'll take another POI if there is one.
The problem with the idea of violence being categorically bad is that violence is based on the idea of individuals experiencing violence. If you deny an individual their identity as a human, then applying violence to them isn't a problem for you.
I don't see in any way in which we are denying people their identities on our side of the house. I think our general mindset is that people should not be violent towards one another, regardless of the situation. People can maintain their identity and their set of morality without exacting violence onto another person. Just because I have experienced violence does not give me the right to exact it upon another. That's what we stand for on proposition. I think identities are pretty solidified regardless of what side of the house we're on. Okay, second argument then on the categorical imperative. What this means is that on our side of the house in World A, people are taught that rules must be followed regardless of the situation, and we think that that is a good thing. That's for two reasons. First, if people are raised under this narrative that violence can never be exacted upon another, regardless of what they might have done to deserve it, that makes people far more likely to abide by other social norms or other laws. For example, never committing other crimes because regardless of what somebody might have done to deserve it. That looks like never stealing from corporations, regardless of how corrupt they may be. And that is a good thing because we will lead to a better society that is far more crimeless and far more moral, because people are going to agree that if they are going to follow this mindset that people never deserve to have this violence exacted upon them, then they're likely going to implement this in every other aspect of their life, just like I showed you in my previous argument about how that falls on opposition, and people are going to see others as deserving of their bad situations. So why is it a good thing when nobody breaks these laws? A couple reasons. First, I know an issue that might arise is that, well, sometimes laws are unjustified and then people have to be able to break them because they're unjust in the first place. I think that under our side of the house in World A, these unjust laws are unlikely to exist in the first place when society recognizes that everything should be equal and people should be seen as equally under the eyes of the law, as I mentioned in my first point. But second, even if there exist laws that are unjustified, if nobody is breaking them in the first place because nobody feels the need to do so on our side of the house, I don't think that will become a general societal problem. Rather, the whole world in and of itself is going to be better because nobody is breaking these societal norms, and nobody will be likely to break laws that are set in place by the government of World A, because people believe that no matter what, they must follow these categorical imperatives and always follow rules, no matter who is giving them and no matter who they are given to. Only on our side of the house are we able to achieve a level of equality and universal morality that has never before been seen, and that's why I'm so proud to propose.
I thank the first speaker of the proposition for her remarks. I would now like to call upon the first speaker of the opposition to open opposition's case for us in a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Hear, hear.
Great, thank you. Just setting my timer. Okay. Sorry, just sorting my notes. Okay, time starts in 3, 2, 1. On world A, when people think that violence is never justified against any other people, the problem is not whether violence is committed. The problem is who you believe to be people on that basis proud to oppose. 3 things for you today on as a first speaker on side opposition. First, refuting everything we've heard so far from the prop case. Second, our stance. Third, our constructive case. Okay, so the first thing that we get from them is this idea that you get fundamental equality because everybody doesn't deserve to be treated with violence. So then you extend that principle and you say everyone is the same or everyone should be treated the same. Note that we think this is actually reversed. So you say anything is justified as long as it's violence according to that line of logic, right? So you say, it's okay if I economically oppress you. It's okay if I politically oppress you. It's okay if I don't treat you like a human being as long as I'm not being violent. We think that that's just not how you can extend that argument further. They can't just take equality and go from there. Secondly, on this idea, no, thank you. On this idea that karma is on our side of the house because people are going to view violent acts as if they were already justified in the first place. Look, we're going to give you in our stance the conditions to which violence is justified. We think it's really easy for people to understand those conditions and to be able to assess whether those conditions apply. So if people know that ECAT shoved you and that's why you punched her, that's probably okay unless you punched her without her shoving you in the first place, right? We don't understand why people aren't able to make that judgment call themselves. Okay, onto our stance then. We tell you that violence is justified when it prevents oppression and when the government uses it to prevent further violence, right? So this looks like things like the fact that the mechanism for preventing violence has to be through violence. I'm going to talk to you more about that in my second point about regulation. Okay, 2 points then. First, on oppression. Second, on regulation. Why is violence the only way to remove oppression and to remove structural barriers? Because oppression hides violence in the idea of humanity, right? So a neo-Nazi doesn't justify the idea that Jewish people should literally be genocided against by saying that violence is okay. They justify the idea by explaining that Jewish people aren't people, that they aren't people who are fundamentally the same as everybody else. That's how they justify violence. Note then that in really entrenched oppression, nobody realizes that violence is being perpetuated. So for example, when you have slavery being justified in the Bible, nobody realizes that slavery is perpetuated through violence because they think that that's how everything was in the beginning anyways. That's how things should be, and that's what Black people are. So we think that means then that you don't notice violence and you don't understand violence to be wrong because you don't think that it's actually applied to individuals. It's not actually applied to real people. Okay, why is oppression, how does oppression get solved by violence? Because oppression nearly quells all these forms of soft power that an individual has access to. So for example, oppression removes my ability, in oppressive regimes, remove my ability to speak out. They remove my ability to use my vote to hold the government accountable, right? We think economic oppression prevents my spending power so that I can contribute I can have power in a consumer market, right? However, no matter all the soft power that they remove from me, they will never be able to take my fist from me and prevent me from committing violence to stop that oppression. That means that no matter how oppressive a system is, people can still always rise up from it by using violence. Note also then the specific mechanisms that oppression uses to justify or to remove soft power. So this looks like things like restricting access to education. This looks like things like widespread propaganda justifying oppression. This looks like things like literally changing the public psyche so that they don't view the people who are oppressed as humans. Again, I talked about that already. And a really great example of this is the Civil War, right? So you talk about in World A, nobody is going to view slavery as a problem because they don't view Black people as people, right? So now the only mechanisms that the slaves have to actually escape a system of oppression and racism is going to be through things like protests, or through things like rallies, like mechanisms which are going to largely fail, because the only way you can break out of a system of oppression for an uneducated slave is through your fists, is through aligning with everyone else, is to use your numbers to fight against an oppressive system. Why is violence justified against oppression? 2 reasons. First, because there's a weighing of rights that are going on. So they tell us about this like categorical imperative, but we just don't think that's really valid. We think that individuals have a bunch of rights, including the right not to have violence be used against them. However, in the system of oppression, nearly all your other rights could be stripped away from you. So your right to speech, your right to freedom of movement, all of those types of things are lost. So we think that, sure, you might strip someone else away from their right to avoid violence, but you gain all of those other rights back. Secondly, because I told you that violence is hidden in oppression, right? So it might not necessarily be a direct part of the oppression, but because of the structural systems that exist, violence is solved when you end oppressive systems, right? So the very fact that slaves were unable to leave the specific like plantations that they were that they were forced to work in is a form of violence, but that doesn't actually get solved based on the analysis that I gave you, right? Okay, second, on regulation. Why does government regulation require violence? Because all sorts of government power stem from violence. So the courts but impose their laws on civilians through the threat of incarceration, right? The taxation agencies mechanize the ability for them to tax people by literally having government agents show up with assault rifles at your door, right? That's the threat that's given to you to justify those types of regulations. Why is it then that those regulations are such a good thing? Because taxes and other forms of government intervention are hugely important for society, because they prevent things like the oppression that I was talking about before, because they enable people to have access to soft power and to have access to all the other non-violent solutions to the issues they're experiencing. We think that actually reduces violence in society, because, for example, poor people no longer have to steal from a store in order to feed their family, right? The second is that it is a mechanism for directly preventing violence. So they tell us, they can see this idea, and they're definitely right, that violence is going to occur on both sides of the house. The only issue is there's no way to counter that violence on their side of the house. So if someone makes that stand and says, I'm going to do something morally wrong, nobody can do anything about it. Right? All they can do is like criticize them. Like, okay, nobody cares. They already know they're doing something wrong and they're willing to make that decision. Then the only way that you can prevent them from further inflicting violence is to inflict that violence yourself. Arvin's going to talk more about this in self-defense, but note that this is uniquely a government regulation as well, right? So the only way that you can really get a serial killer to stop is to lock him up forcibly and put him in jail at the threat of being shot by the police. We think that that means that you actually get a real mechanism for preventing violence, because we agree that violence is a huge harm. We think that at the end of the day, we're the only side that makes it really difficult for violence to occur. Okay, let's close this debate on a little bit of weighing, right? So look, at the end of the day, they want to tell us about things like equality. We tell you that prejudice is always going to exist, right? Stereotypes are always going to exist. The only way you ensure that those stereotypes do not become entrenched and that those prejudices do not become commonplace is by using violence to fight oppression, proud to oppose.
I thank the first opposition speaker for his fine remarks. I now call upon the second proposition speaker to further the government case for us in a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Hear, hear.
Cool. Am I audible to everybody?
Yep, you can be heard.
All right. As your second proposition speaker, I'll be doing 3 things for you today. Firstly, reconstructing my partner's points. Secondly, refuting everything you've just heard from the last speech. And then thirdly, providing side propositions, final contention. All right, let's move on to some reconstruction. On our point on teaching equality, opposition responds by saying we justify other means of violence that hurts people even more. We have 2 responses to this. Firstly, violence isn't just physical, right? We think that if you bully a person verbally, if you yell a slur at a person, we think this is still violence. But secondly, our second point actually counters this argument. We told you specifically how when people are taught that violence is bad no matter what, it will also be applicable to other moral values, right? Such as, I don't know, honesty and being kind to people. We think that will apply in all instances just as well. So we see that this point just doesn't stand. We also provided a point on teaching people to follow values no matter what. We didn't really get a clear response to this, so we expect to hear one in the next speech. So let's move on to some rebuttal. Side opposition gave us a point on seeing people as people or something around that, and they gave us a point on the Civil War and a lot of other examples. They tell us that on our side, we take away a person's ability to fight oppression now that they aren't able to use violence. So firstly, we'd like to note that this just isn't the case, right? And that, for example, we'll give you the exact same example as they gave us, the civil rights movement, right? Not the civil rights, the Civil War, right? The reason that for so long white people felt that they could abuse Black people was because they thought they were an exception to the moral principle that applies to everybody. They thought that Black people didn't apply to this and that they could use their violence against them. They thought this was an exception, right? So we see that doesn't stand. Another example is we can talk about the abuse of cops, right? How cops abuse their power. For so long, cops have been thought as people that are exempt from this principle. They because they have authority over people and because they are cops, people have always thought that, all right, I guess because a cop has deemed this person as an evil person, I guess he can beat this person up arbitrarily. So we see that just doesn't work. All right, now on to their second point on regulations. Under this point, we heard an idea that our side cannot counter violence. So we have a couple of responses. Firstly, we think in our world, we still have things like jail that serve as a deterrent and that this actually counters violence. A second point, though, is that we don't want people responding to violence with violence when it's unnecessary. That's literally the point. We want people to find other means to resolve conflicts. But thirdly, we like to talk about an extreme case, like a murderer, right? So let's say a murderer is coming up to kill you or whatever. We're not saying, no, this person has to stand there and hold up a sign that says, killing is bad. This person can act with violence. The point is that after this person acts with violence, they understand that their actions were still bad, that hurting a person is still bad at the end of the day. All right, so let's move on to our third point on improved international relations and how this basically decreases wars. We've seen political leaders believing that they're exempt from a principle that they've been taught, that everybody's been taught since young, that violence is bad. Because these people in power believe that because of their authority, educational background, and experience to make informed choices, that their choice to bomb a country to start a war is justified. These leaders believe that their country's circumstances is an exception so they can use violent actions. All right, so why is this bad? Well, this notion is what fuels wars. It's what creates conflict between nations. At the end of the day, it's the people who have to suffer. In ops world, when we recognize that violence is applicable in some instances, it won't be an actual choice for people to choose violence. So what do I mean by this? Well, we have to recognize, like we said before, in both worlds, violence will occur by some people one way or another. The difference is that we recognize it as a bad thing. Therefore, we eliminate it as a first choice. In ops world, when we give leaders the option of violence, their immediate thinking will be to try to justify each scenario that they encounter as to why violence should be used. Here's an example. So instead of thinking of using sanctions or things like, or coming to a mutual agreement, what a lot of times leaders think first is, okay, how can I convince the public that what country X has done is so horrendous that we can go into their country and cause chaos and use violence? This looks like the US going into Iraq, convincing the public that there's mass weapons of destruction so they can meddle in that territory, even though there is none. Violence was the first option because the US thought as thought of their circumstance as an exception. So how does the resolution change this? Before I move on, sure.
Given that countries are probably going to act unethically anyways, the only way for you to prevent a country like the Soviet Union from using nuclear power as a tool of extortion is to use nuclear deterrence yourself and use nuclear power and the threat of violence to deter violence in the first place.
All right. I'm getting to that later on to this point, and I'll explain how I'm going to respond to that POI within this point. So how does the resolution change this? Well, politicians will find other solutions to resolve conflicts, possibly more peaceful means. But okay, this is the part that kind of responds to your POI. Now, even if they don't find more peaceful means to resolve conflicts, we think that there isn't this idea of that violence is okay to be used that still exists afterwards, that makes it so they think their actions were justified. Because even if you have to participate in a war, in bombing another country for the safety of your nation, at least now these countries consider killing millions of people as something terrible, instead of in world B, where they try to justify it and try to fit it into and try to justify their actions. Because at the end of the day, taking a life away in an emergency still takes a life away. And this means there's less of a chance for these countries to repeat their violent actions, since the mindset now is that violence is something to be avoided and is bad. So overall, why is this good? Well, we have more peaceful resolutions and a lot of unnecessary war, and this overall saves a lot of soldiers. Less innocent people are involved, and we're not creating damage that will affect a country for generations. For all these reasons, so proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the second speaker from the proposition for their remarks. I now call upon the second speaker from the opposition to further the opposition case for us in a speech not exceeding 8 minutes. Hear, hear.
Okay, my speech will begin. I want to stand for your preferred POIs, and my speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. Judges, the case the proposition presents in this debate is one racked with contradictions. First, they tell you that violence is never justified, regardless of what the target has done in the past. And they tell you that violence is justified if they're acting violent towards you. This is for those reasons they lose this debate, and which is why we are so proud to oppose. 3 things for you in this speech. First, I'm going to reconstruct my partner's case. Then I'm going to be refuting all the constructive material we've heard from side propositions so far. Then I'll be providing my own contention on self-defense. So my partner gave you 2 points, one on oppression and one on regulation. What has the proposition said in response? In response to my partner's point on oppression, they simply told us that this oppression my partner talked about is solely justified by people making exceptions to this golden rule of no violence. However, it's clearly not the case. First off, not all forms of oppression are fundamentally violent. Many forms of oppression use soft power, like, for example, denying people from economic and social mobility, or denying people's access to things like public transportation, denying their access to being able to start their own business, for example, as we see in Jim Crow South. I'll take you later. Not only this, if you have an individual who fundamentally does not see an oppressed group as human, if you have, let's say, a white supremacist who doesn't see minorities as humans, why would they apply the ethical rules that they apply to humans to them? Obviously, they'll continue doing racist and despicable things, and continue doing violent things as well. So clearly, this refutation follows my partner's case still stands. But
okay. In what scenario is someone more likely to act violently racist? In a world where they think people are an exception to morals, or in a world where they think everybody should be treated the same?
All right. Yes. Well, we think that this characterization that people in world A think everybody should be treated the same isn't really consistent with the prime moral principle of world A is that all people should be treated non-violently. However, most prejudiced groups have used a tactic of dehumanization to try and say that their opponents are not people in the first place, so clearly they won't be applying these ethical principles to them. So this doesn't really make sense. They also tried to refute my partner's point on regulation by first off saying that, we have jails where we could put bad people in. No, you don't have jails. the prison system is fundamentally enforced through violence. What happens when you try to put someone in jail and they're distressed? You're going to have to use violence against them, right? What happens when you try to break prison? You're going to have to use violence to force them back into a prison, right? I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but clearly this won't exist on World A. So this sort of mechanism for preventing violence does not exist on your side of the house. They also tell us that people are able to use self-defense if they're being threatened by, let's say, a murderer. However, the first speaker of side proposition explicitly told us that that violence should not be used even on people who have done bad things in the past, right? You shouldn't, have this concept of karma. This also applies to people who have violated this one ethical rule and people who have committed violence. So clearly, self-defense can't exist on your side of the house because you said yourself that it is categorically wrong. So clearly, this refutation falls as well. My partner's point still stands. So now that I've proven that, I'm going to be going into some refutation of side proposition's constructive material. So what are they giving us? First, they give us this point about equality. My partner took this down by explaining how other forms of inequality which aren't violent are completely justified, and on his point about oppression, about how using violence to reduce inequalities is considered categorically unethical on your side of the house. The only real response to this is predicated on the assertion that teaching nonviolence will also lead to the teaching of other values like equity, like treating people with respect, all that. However, they don't offer any analysis for this. Second, I've already given you an example of how people can believe in nonviolence but still be prejudiced towards others. If you want an example, many of the followers of Gandhi were very clearly nonviolent, were also very significant sexist and misogynist, and many of them even committed domestic abuse because they simply didn't see, their wives or the wives as people who are subject to the same ethical rules as everyone else. Clearly, prejudice can still exist in a system with this sort of golden rule of non-violence. They also have not attempted to take down the refutation my partner gave on their point about how about karma, and how this point assumes that all unjust law just won't exist, which doesn't hold out to scrutiny, as you can harm someone financially, you can harm them structurally, you can harm someone without committing explicit violence against them. So many of these unjust laws will still exist. Their point follows, as my partner told you, and they haven't attempted to reconstruct this, but they have given an additional point on international relations, where they simply said that all countries will act ethically in accordance to this rule, and this will lead to less conflict. However, two things. First off, not all countries act in accordance to their ethical principles. If you look at the People's Republic of China, who has a constitution stating that all people are equal, yet they are literally committing genocide against entire ethnic groups in Xinjiang. Second, if countries like China and Russia continue to disrupt the world order and continue to disrupt global peace, violence can act as a deterrent towards them. For instance, take a look at how few significant conflicts there have been since the introduction of nuclear weapons. Before the 20th century, conflict was simply a fact of life. Now, it is a rarity to have a major conflict in our lifetime. So clearly, this sort of deterrence, which relies on the threat of violence, has worked. So their point about international relations follows as well. So now they refuted all of the constructive material that Cyclops has given us. I'm going to be going into my point on self-defense. Now, I'm going to prove to you why self-defense, the right to self-defense, is a necessary right that only exists on our side of the house. First off, why is self-defense important? Regardless of ethical framework, those who do wrong will always exist. I think that the proposition can concede to this. So that means that in a world where moral individuals don't exercise violence at all, but immoral individuals are free to exercise violence for their own personal gain, then these moral individuals will essentially be at the mercy of these immoral individuals. Essentially, this is a world where moral values don't matter because the immoral individuals are the ones who can have all the power in this society. Now, clearly, any ethical system has to allow for the concept of self-defense if it believes in the concept of nonviolence of any form. However, why is there no self-defense in World A? Well, the key axiom of World A is that violence is categorically wrong. So it's contradictory for anyone in World A to use violence and still claim ethicality. In fact, side proposition told us themselves that violence ought to not occur based on previous actions. This clearly also applies to committing violence yourself. You can't use violence on someone who's committed violence. That still is considered unethical in World A. So why does it actually matter? This means that because people lose the right to defend themselves in World A, World A exists in a permanent state of moral anarchy. This means that firstly, all the benefits that side prop has given you about the benefits of their moral code, even if we assume these still stand, they still are completely inapplicable to the world that they have described because of this world's fundamental inability to maintain its own moral code. Second, this simply means that those who are moral are punished and those who are immoral are rewarded with the sort of bounty of constantly being able to commit violence without any threat of retaliation. I think that self-defense is a necessary, I think it only exists in world B, where violence is sometimes justified for those reasons so proud to propose.
I thank the second speaker of the opposition for their fine remarks. I would now like to call upon the first speaker of the opposition to deliver the opposition summary, which would not exceed 4 minutes. Hear, hear.
Okay, great, thank you. Setting my timer. Okay. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Proposition lost this debate when they failed to understand how prejudice and ignorance and bias will always exist within humans. And the only way to make sure that they don't become entrenched and systemically harmful is through violence. On that basis, proud to oppose 3 themes: oppression and inequality, violence mitigation, and international relations and deterrence. Okay, first on oppression. We gave you 2 main mechanisms for how we get rid of oppression. So we told you, first of all, that you actually, when you talk about not being violent against like everybody deserves not to have violence acted against them, that everybody is constrained based on your personal beliefs, based on your personal preferences. Aryan gave you example of Gandhi. I give you example of Nazis. I give you example of white people reading the Bible, right? We told you that the understanding of humanity, the understanding of who is in this group of everybody is fundamentally like a failed concept that they don't, and it's never going to be universal. The second thing we told you is that oppression is often through things that are non-violent, like soft power, right? We told you, for example, how people during the Gilded Age were able to oppress peasants and oppress workers in the Industrial Revolution through things like crippling poverty, right? Through things like exploitation of workers. We tell you that aristocracies are hugely oppressive, but they aren't necessarily able to use violence as a mechanism for oppression. You still remove those types of systems of oppression, because sure, you might be violating one right for people not to experience oppression, but you actually liberate others for all their other rights. We told you that in the weighing of the first point. They don't engage with this at all, right? Okay, let's address this idea of equality that they get starting from their first speech, right? Because I think Aryan and I take this down really well throughout the bench, right? Because we told you, like, we gave you a bunch of reasons why you're probably not going to get people actually treating everybody the same, right? We told you, for example, that individuals are always going to have biases. They're always going to have prejudices. So the idea of equality just randomly emerging because you have a categorical moral idea is just ridiculous. Okay, let's talk about violence mitigation. This is probably the most important theme in this round because it actually weighs against all the categorical imperative material they have. So the more you buy this idea that violence is harmful, the more this theme falls on our side of the house because we actually mitigate that violence, right? So the first thing we told you is that regulation creates conditions that don't need violence. So for example, when you alleviate people out of poverty, that allows them to not pursue a life of crime, that prevents that makes sure they're not forced from stealing or from things like holding people at gunpoint, right? We told you that taxes, for example, are hugely beneficial. They don't actually give us any like engagement in that, right? But secondly, we told you how self-defense uniquely prevents violence, right? We told you that the only way you can stop an immoral individual who's acting violently is probably through violence yourself. It's probably through threatening violence. It's probably through being just as violent as them, so they'll be willing to back down. Again, we don't really actually hear any engagement on this because Aryan told you that self-defense is uniquely going to happen on our side of the house. Thirdly, on international relations and deterrence, we think this is actually really interesting because all of the clutch that I told you about actually applies in this point as well. So for example, they talk about how nations won't act immorally and they won't engage in military conflict. The same analysis goes for individuals that goes for countries. Countries are going to behave unethically. Aryan already told you that, right? But more notably, note what happens on their side of the house when one country behaves immorally. They get all the power, right? They get all of the extortion and all of the power, that the benefits of violence. First off, we think that just means there's a huge there's a much greater incentive to pursue violence on their side of the house because they know they won't be met with more violence. But note the mechanism of nuclear deterrence I told you. The threat of violence itself is so great that it deters violence on both sides. That's how you actually de-escalate things like the Cold War. Look, at the end of the day, we're the only side of the house that gives you a mechanism for preventing violence. We're the side that gives you a mechanism for preventing oppression. On that basis, proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition summary for his fine remarks. Oh, I feel like we are missing our prop summary speaker. ECAT from prop, are you able to get in contact with your partner, please?
Hello, something happened. Is it all right if if our reply speaker gives their speech through their phone?
Sure, that's not a problem.
Hold on a minute. We're just contacting each other.
No worries.
Just to double check, this is the Zoom room for the seniors, right?
Yep, exactly.
All right, cool. Thank you.
The easiest fix may also be that she calls you on the phone, and because you're able to connect to us perfectly fine, you put your phone on speakerphone and she delivers it through there.
I think the problem is the link wasn't working, so I'm just getting the information again.
Okay, excellent. And then if in about a minute she isn't able to do it, why don't you exchange phone numbers and then do the secondary method?
Ekaterina, I've just sent you all the information. It should all be working. If not, you can tell me and I'll send you another link.
Could you send me another link? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Give me 1 minute.
And while Isabel is doing that, as a backup, ECAT, can you call Dia on the phone, please, with your phone? Thank you.
I've just sent the link to you, Ekaterina. If that doesn't work, I can send you another link.
I think we actually have her here.
I'm so sorry. My computer overheated and like shut down in the middle of Leo's speech.
No worries. So I did note down when you missed his speech. The only you missed, 110 after, is he moved on to his international relations point, basically just a recap of immorality, deterrence, mutually assured destruction, all of that. So whenever you're ready, you may begin your speech, which will not exceed 4 minutes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay. Opposition has gotten this debate, unfortunately, mischaracterized and made it about whether or not violence should exist in the first place. They made it about whether or not like discrimination, oppression, and all things bad should even exist, and whichever side of the house is going to be able to completely mitigate all of those things. But look, let's say that both of these things are exactly symmetrical on either side of the house. Which way is going to be the best way to combat those things? In a world where we see people as an exception to the rule, or in a world where nobody is a special case scenario? That's why proposition wins on the moral ground. Two main areas of clash in this speech. First, which version of society actually gets less violence, and second, on individual freedom. So let's first talk about who actually gets less violence. Now, opposition weirdly tried to get out of this violence idea by saying that, well, people who are racist don't actually see minorities as people, so it depends on who we're even classifying as people in this debate. I mean, we found this quite odd. Like, let's just assume that everybody is a person. I think that it's still going to be worse on their side of the house. But all of the examples that they gave us of violence are examples in which marginalized groups are seen as the exception from the rule. So in their example of slaves won't be able to revolt with violence when they're trying to free themselves from their shackles. Okay, things like that are highly unlikely to arise in World A in the first place when people are taught to view everybody the same. In fact, it's far more likely for new waves of slavery and new types of oppression to arise on World B because we see that other people are deserving of a different type of fate than we are, because people deserve what comes to them when they are exceptions to this rule. That's exactly where this sort of racist rhetoric is likely to arise. And ECAT told you this in her speech about how for police brutality, for example, those cops are seen as the exception to the rule. On our side of the house, nobody exists as those exceptions. Then everybody is seen under the exact same lens. And that's why it's far less likely for that to happen on our side of the house. For in these scenarios, when somebody is acting in a violent manner, there's the two different ways to deal with it. There's the reciprocating with violence that we get on side opposition, and there's the treating everybody equally and choosing not to respond that way on our side of the house, which is going to lead to a far more equitable and justified society. Let's get into my second area of clash then on individual freedom quickly. Opposition cared a lot about how like social movements can act reciprocally to violence in a violent manner. But it's okay if we don't have people acting violently in self-defense, because they will have less scenarios in which they even need to in the first place on our side of the house. So all of this ideas of self-defense and how people deserve to be able to react with violence, if we have that on their side of the house, all it does is perpetuate this cycle of violence and reciprocating with violence over and over and over again, and getting absolutely nowhere with that. Only on our side of the house, when people are taught that regardless of the scenario, violence is not something that you can respond to a situation with, is when we're likely to arise in a state of society where people aren't even enacting violence on each other at all in the first place. And so that reciprocation isn't something that we need to worry about, because people won't have scenarios in which they need to act in self-defense if violence isn't being enacted onto them in the first place. On our side of the house, we don't have that vision where people are exceptions to the rule, where people live in poverty because they deserve it, where people are abused because they deserve it. Only on proposition is everybody viewed under the same lens, and we achieve the universal morality that never before has been able to be achieved. That's why I'm so proud to propose.
I thank the proposition summary for their fine remarks. I thank everyone for what was a solid debate. And now what we'll do is the judges, we will move into the deliberation room, come to a decision, and then the organizers will tell you what happens next. So great work, everyone.
Thank you for the round.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, this is a great round. It's a tough resolution, so.
Yeah, really great round, guys.
Yeah.
Great, yeah. And I just want to say I really appreciate this tournament as well. So thanks everybody who helped organize this.
Isabella, are you here?
Yeah, I am.
I'm just wondering, is the winner being announced here before the award ceremonies, or is it being announced at the award ceremonies?
We'll also announce them at the award ceremonies where the juniors are.
Gotcha. So do you want me to announce it here and then do the whole like reason for decision spiel as well?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, excellent. So I promise I will keep this brief just so that everyone is able to, move on to the next stage of the tournament. But basically what will happen is I'll give the I'll give the call, then reason for decision. And then finally, my panelists who were excellent in the discussion will give you guys directed feedback as well. So my panel, we had a very wonderful discussion and we did come to a quick consensus. So it was a unanimous decision and we all voted for side opposition. So team FDTZS, I believe. Congratulations to you guys. Commiserations to team FDTPG. So basically, what I will do is I will explain the reason for decision. I won't go too much into detail because it was quite a clear call from our end, but I will make sure all of the details that were important and discussed in our discussion are highlighted. So I think before I get into anything about the themes that existed within the round, there is one underlying reason as to why the opposition was able to win, and that's based on their consistency within the round. Proposition does suffer from quite a bit of flip-flopping between things, but also not being able to have a consistent line as to what their world is going to look like. And this is something that became an issue in all of the themes that I will discuss later. But the main one I want to highlight so that I don't repeat myself over and over again is basically what is violence and what does it look like? And what is it that their side is truly trying to remove? Is it a world of physical violence? Is it a world of things like abuse and slurs? Is it a world of also removing things like economic oppression? And why in that world can things like jails then exist because you've broadened the term of violence so large? So given that, it is very hard for us to understand what proposition is truly fighting for. And on a base level, opposition is able to give us a consistent conception that violence being used in a way that we understand the limitations by which we can do it is important because it creates certain frameworks in society that we're able to ensure things like law and order, et cetera, et cetera. So moving on to specific themes that existed within the round, there were three in particular. The first is just on societal values and things like rule and order. Why is it that proposition was unable to win in this theme? So from the prop, we hear a few things. The first is that they are likely going to exist in a world wherein individuals from birth and from the day that they exist in this world are going to believe that violence is incredibly harmful. And that is something that is good because it leads to things like equality and creates this kind of categorical imperative that certain things are bad and you cannot break certain laws. Here's the problem that we had with it as a panel. The issue, the first one, was it was unclear why on their side of the house, even more people are likely going to be born good, given the first prop concession that violence will exist on their side of the house anyways, and opposition convincingly tells us that it is done through irrationality. So it's unclear how that irrationality is fixed on prop. But even if that wasn't the case, proposition also doesn't prove to us how it's going to extend to other forms of morality, for instance, all equality that exists, and does turn a blind eye to things like nuanced oppression that is likely going to exist. The panel agreed there was very little link work done, especially down the bench, starting with 1P to 2P, which means it was hard for us to credit a lot of the biggest impacts that came out in this round for them in terms of trying to broaden the scope of having equality and strong moral values in society. What then did we hear from opposition? We heard a few things. That first, in either world, violence will exist as conceded by 1P, which basically means we need to have some kind of way in order to combat it, i.e., bad people need to be put in bad places or at least be put away so that they can't do bad things upon society. So this is where the entirety of the whole jail and whether or not jail is violence or not thing happens. And we do agree with the opposition that jailing requires some threat of violence, i.e. you cannot walk out of a jail for fear of being, put back into your cell or having some kind of violence used as a deterrent for you to leave. But second of all, they are able to tell us that moral frameworks can only exist properly in society when there is some kind of threat of violence that exists, i.e. paying taxes out of fear of not going to jail, which we've already concluded is some kind of violence, or things like making sure people don't break any laws for fear of violence from the police. This meant that only can we have law and order from opposition's world, especially when they convincingly tell us that people are likely going to abuse the peacefulness of proposition to try to consolidate and gain power. That is specifically why opposition wins the first theme. On the second, about minority groups and individuals, here is where opposition begins to particularly pull ahead for two reasons. While on the proposition, they do claim that minorities would have never likely been oppressed in the first place. We are unclear why that is true, given the fact that individual people saw them as lesser than humans and more animalistic. We do think that proposition does try to dismiss this quite flippantly by saying, no, it is humanity as humanity. But this doesn't take down the important aspect of the opposition material, which is that even though you may believe all humans are humans, that is not the way in which others believe them to be and believe that they were subhuman or not of the same class and species. Even though prop does try to say, look, these kinds of individuals believe that they are the exception to the rule. It is because they are unable to prove why these individuals would have been seen on the equal level as human in the eyes of oppressors. It is unclear how they are able to access that kind of benefit or that world on their side. What did opposition importantly tell us then? They tell us that minority individuals are oftentimes oppressed through many non-violent means to try to solidify violence against them. So for instance, they have all of their money and all of their capital taken away. They have all of their rights, including things like freedom of speech, taken away, which basically means they have no forms of trying to access freedom other than their fists and having a majority of individuals try to combat violently against these kinds of groups. It is unclear from the proposition what other means they have to fight against oppressive groups for minorities. And because they're unable to prove, one of the most vulnerable actors are unable to leave systems of oppression, they also lose on this theme. The third and final is just on international order and wars between nations. On proposition from the second, we hear that violence will always be second guessed and will never be the first and primary tool used by organizations. So for instance, the invasion in places like Iraq would never have happened given people are more likely to think through their thoughts versus trying to always jump to violence. What did we hear from the opposition? We heard once again that individual people are likely still to make power grabs if they're irrational and are bad actors. But second of all, that individual people need ways in order to hold themselves accountable. And the reason why we are in such a relatively more peaceful world is because of the acceleration of things like weaponry and in particular nuclear arms. The reason why opposition wins is twofold. The first is they are able to once again provide a mechanism by way of proving that we are less likely to have more wars break out because of things like mutually assured destruction. But second, they tell us that there are always going to be corrupt individuals who are going to make power grabs. And in order for us to combat them, it is very important that we have this in our arsenal. Particularly, they say people are able to get away with violence and not face any repercussions because no one else is going to react violently enough to be able to combat them. And therefore, they also win on this third theme. Though smaller and less contested within the round, winning all three themes, that is the reason why we gave it to the side opposition. So congratulations, commiserations. If you guys have questions, let me know. But now I will put it off to my panelists to give some feedback for you all. Thanks, everyone.
Godswill, you want to go first? Or would you prefer I go first? I'm cool with whatever. All right, I can go. So yeah, I mean, I obviously very much so agree with what the chair said in terms of decision. So I'm just going to give a couple pieces of content feedback. These didn't determine or implicate my decision in any way because these weren't arguments the debaters made, but these are just things that I think could make the affirmative and negative better, as well as arguments that perhaps you want to stay away from in the future. For the affirmative, I would highly recommend never defending the categorical imperative. It's a philosophical concept that was developed by Immanuel Kant, and it's pretty central to Kantianism, who is not only a colonial philosophy more generally, but Kant was a virulent anti-Black and anti-African specifically. His particular analysis about why the categorical imperative is necessary was that the categorical imperative is required for rational agents in order to act morally. And his argument was that African people can never be rational. They could only be semi-rational by being beaten by bamboo canes and being enslaved by colonizers. So I would certainly recommend never defending this because it's just a colonial philosophy used to justify colonial violence, plain and simple. It's indivisible from that as a philosophical project because rationality is pretty internal to the categorical imperative as a philosophical concept. Again, this didn't play into my decision because these weren't arguments the negative made. These were definitely arguments the negative should have made and would have been very compelling and offensive against the AF, but this is something just in general you don't want to defend. For the negative, I think that your contentions are a bit contradictory. And again, these are not arguments the affirmative made, but I think the affirmative could have exploited this in a way that could potentially be detrimental to you, right? Because your first contention is talking about how, the liberation of colonized and oppressed people requires violence, but then your second contention sort of defends state violence as necessary and something that's good, right? You defend policing, you defend prisons as something that's good, which particularly in the context of settler colonies like Canada and America is something that's particularly imperialist and violence against oppressed people. And that the very reason that violence is necessary for liberation is because of the existence of state and imperialist violence like policing, like prisons, right? So I think that this contradiction could have potentially been very detrimental to the negative in being able to get access to your offense because you kind of do what we call in debate a double turn, right? Where you read arguments that turn your own arguments. So I think would have perhaps been more strategic given that your first contention was so strong and your first contention was the primary thrust of not only the way that you developed the majority of your offense, but also implicated your third contention in reference to self-defense. I think you should have just made this contention even longer and justified it even better, right? Maybe had some arguments about how oppression and violence is not an ideological thing, it's a material thing, which means the only way you're able to solve it is through material practice that requires violence, et cetera, et cetera. Read arguments about how there's never been a successful liberation struggle or successes of liberation against, reactionary violence without revolutionary violence, et cetera. I think that compounded with the self-defense contention would have made your offense even stronger because it means that you don't potentially open yourself up to the affirmative getting access to a double turn. But again, these weren't arguments that were made, but just perhaps strategic things to think about in the future. But that's all for me.
I just want to clarify. Can you go into more about the relationship between the categorical imperative and colonialism? I'm just really curious because I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, so basically obviously this could be a very large discussion, but the TLDR is basically that as a part of the way that liberalism was created as a type of philosophical and political project in order to justify the initial stages of European imperialism and settler colonization of occupied Turtle Island, which are the land masses that, we're occupying or on now. The specific way that Kantianism fit into that was through justifying and elevating particular agents as what is considered to be human or what is considered to be rational, right? That was a big thrust of what Kant's arguments was that the human and the rational agent is able to engage within morally and that they must engage morally and they must engage within this transcendental ethical system, right? So it kind of plays into, it occupies in sort of the way that it operated as a force of colonialism and sort of the analysis that you're forwarding about how oppression oftentimes utilizes dehumanization in order to justify its violence, right? That was a piece of what Kant did in his philosophical project was justifying colonizers, right? Europeans, those of us who are white, as those that are considered to be rational acting agents, right? Subjects, whereas colonized people, particularly Africans, were objects that can never be rational, that never had access to the categorical imperative, right? So I think that's sort of the analysis that you want to forward if you're making these arguments in the context of debate. But there's a lot of literature that's out, that you can find and read that goes into it more in depth and has a lot more, warranted analysis. But that's sort of the TLDR of it.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Okay, yeah, so for me, I think that I have a couple of words for proposition. in terms of concessions, you see, at every point in time in the debate, you need to be careful what you concede with. So first of all, the concession about how violence is going to always exist in both worlds. And then as a bit of rebuttal, you guys, you tried to point out how there's going to be a continuation of violence existing in opposition world where there is a um, reciprocation of violence with violence, right? So say for instance, someone has done you wrong and then you want to respond with violence and all of that. So ideally, if you're going to make such argument and say, because of the fact that people will always respond to violence with violence, there's going to be a continuous existence of violence. You need to then mechanize on the fact that, in state school, there are people who are always willing to commit some sort of crimes against others, right? So, or people who are always going to take to the like who are going to take the very first step of committing to violence. And so if such people exist, opposition shows you that those people exist in terms of first of all, people who commit crimes and ought to be incarcerated. So if those people exist, therefore you need them to know that you need to do more than just consider violence is going to exist in the world, but then you need to know that violence in itself is unethical. You need to then show that, see, because of the possible existence of violence and how it's going to really marginalize a lot of people and objectify them. You need to show how your word caters for such people. So what do you now suggest for instances where the government is oppressive? What do you do? Do you say, because at the very least, the whole idea of saying, let's live in a world where there is no violence, let's not respond to violence with violence. Let's look at it as something that is very unethical and morally reprehensible. If you want to imagine such a scenario, what then you want to discourage every other person who would want to fight against oppressive regimes, you're obviously discouraging the use of violence in itself. So ideally, you then need to profile a different solution as to how you mitigate the problems that exist in status quo. So ideally, if you concede with the possible existence of all of those problems that could result, as opposition showed you, that could result from violence, you need to then show how your word ameliorates those problems. If you don't show or a counterfactual of what opposition tells you, then you're definitely not hitting the debate at its heart. Because where it has now been said, you're not hitting it exactly. So they give you a list of problems that could exist and how in their world they are more proactive with solving those problems. But then, and then, yeah, I think more of what you would have done was to show a very workable model that was going to be very effective in mitigating the problems that they pointed out from opposition. If you had done that, then definitely you would have had a very nice case. So it's not like the way I like to think about debate is motions comes with the aim of solving a societal problem. So in every motion or in every debate topic, you just need to identify the problem and how it relates to status quo, the possible problems that are bound to happen, and then bring up a possible solution to that problem, and then show how that solution in itself is going to be effective in solving the problem, and then how it's even a legitimate tool to take to in the first place. And then you also show a level of comparative. So in the long run, if you're able to show all of this, then well, you have a very wonderful model in itself. So I think next time you should first of all be very mindful of what you concede to, because when you concede with violence existing in your world and don't really show or deal with the problems that violence could possibly cause and how it could make the very world you tend to defend an unstable world, then if you don't show how you take away violence and its negative effects, then you need to basically start showing that. So at the very least, I think you should work on concessions. It's a very important part because when you conceive with the wrong idea, it ultimately harms your case in the long run. So I think that's just a lot has been said already. So let me not be overly repetitive.
Excellent. I think we're all done. Isabella, let us know what to do next, just because I think we've all wrapped up as a